Hello, friends,
Welcome to the Liberation Chronicles. I'm Robin Parker.
and I'm Jorge Ceballos. This is another episode of the Liberation Chronicles, a series in which we hope to give voice to liberation in our current historical context and discuss what it means to build a truly inclusive society. Today, we have our second episode. We're really excited to engage again in a conversation with you. And thank you for your support in our first episode. For today, what we're going to be talking about is historical approaches to inclusion in the United States. And we hope to spread a little knowledge and a lot of conversation on approaches to inclusion because they have become divisive topics.
Yeah, the divisiveness is certainly and has been an anti-DEI backlash, wouldn't you say, Jorge?
Yeah,
We've
for
heard,
sure. That's where we are.
yeah, DEI has been discouraged, and some people would say, and blamed for, everything but the kitchen sink, perhaps. So our discussion today hopes to bring some light into that. What in the world are we talking about when we're talking not just about DEI, but issues of inclusion more broadly? And so what I wanted to do, and we're both trainers, and I know that we both like not to weigh people down with too much lecture. So I'm going to keep this brief, but I'm hoping that in doing this, that people can get an informative background so that as they're confronted with people who say, oh, what's this DEI stuff? Why is there so much drama around it? They'll be better informed. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. So, excuse me. Let's talk about what I have called inclusion efforts in the United States. And the reason I have framed it that way is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, can really be seen as a broader effort for inclusion. Frankly, not only in the United States, but for inclusion before the United States was the United States. I want to give some historical examples that are in context from the 1600s to the 1800s as an example. Many people know that the Quakers were abolitionists, and it is also true that they were among the very first in the 1600s and the 1700s to not only oppose slavery, but advocate for the rights of indigenous people. What that meant is that they began to advocate for schools for indigenous people. They began to advocate for the assimilation of indigenous people into the greater society. And many Quakers also stood against the institution of slavery. I learned some of that when I was in school, but here's what I didn't know. When, for example, the Quakers talked about what they felt was the immorality of slavery, they did not also mean the equality of enslaved people. Many of them thought that Black people were of a different kind, and so they shouldn't be enslaved, but they would not be welcome in the Quaker meeting house. They did not see them interacting with other white people at the time. So it was an advance forward, but not the kind of equality that we're talking about today. And also with regard to Native Americans, at the time it was thought that inviting them to be assimilated was a big step. But of course, that assimilation came with great costs, giving up their own culture, as an example, giving up land, as another example. So from the very beginning, perhaps before the very beginning, we can see that there's tension in who are the Americans? Who are the people that are part of this new society? I want to pause just a little bit for the Enlightenment thinkers. Those were people like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and others. The Enlightenment was a really, really big deal. And our founding documents, like the Constitution, were inspired by it. And let me put it in context. If you were born in the 1300s or the 1400s or the 1500s, your life, unless you were part of the nobility or the clergy, could be subject to the whim of the nobility or the ruling class, right? Your ability to own land, your ability to keep your own property was really subject to whoever had the, well, I guess it would be too early to say the biggest guns, but whoever had the biggest army, whoever was ruling the land, and you were simply a subject of theirs, which meant that you couldn't necessarily count on your hard work improving your lot. If you were the wrong religion, if you were the wrong ethnic group, it could be all over for you. The Enlightenment said that there is something inherent in human beings, and especially through the application of logic, that human beings have inalienable rights. That is, that we have rights to land, we have the rights to the fruit of our own labor, and we also have the right to be represented by the government. And indeed, the government is the entity that helps secure those rights. But even then, that was a big, big step forward. But even then, there were really two camps. One of the camps, which was called the moderate Enlightenment, believed that it was incumbent on the educated class, the enlightened people like themselves, to lead the society for the benefit of all people. We might call that an aristocracy. In other words, if you didn't own land, certainly if you weren't male, you would be represented in this government, but you're not going to be able to vote. Sorry. And it wasn't necessarily because those people hated you, but they just didn't think that you had the stuff, right? That you really should legitimately be involved in the engine of government. They also sanctioned the role of religion in the public sphere, although I think it is also fair to say that all of the Enlightenment thinkers were rather suspicious of having too much control by religious institutions. Keep in mind that they were quite aware of how many of the European countries had been rendered apart because of religious strife and struggles, particularly between Catholics and Protestants and among Protestant sects. The second part of the Enlightenment were the radical Enlightenment thinkers, and that included people like Benjamin Franklin. And they said, yep, everybody gets to vote. Everybody has a share. This is a representative government, should be a representative government coming from the bottom up. And that was revolutionary, right? Keep in mind that a lot of folks who were around at that time were uneducated, illiterate, never went to school. They were just working hard with physical labor. And the moderate Enlightenment people said, well, nice folks will protect their interests, but, giving those folks the vote. And the radical Enlightenment people said, yes, everybody gets a vote. This is not a top-down government, or shouldn't be a top-down government, but a bottom-up government. But we should also note that, although I didn't learn this in school, even as they began to talk about their differences, who was included was still not only a matter of contention, but there was some agreement on who should not be included. Women, for example, were not included in representative government. They were thought to be subject to their husbands. In many ways, they were treated like property. So we have even then a tension between the two sides. Some other examples, the Free African Society. After the Revolutionary War, and because of the Enlightenment, free Africans developed civic organizing and started a mutual aid society, particularly in Philadelphia. By the 1790s, there were about 2,000 free Black residents, and that number tended to increase. It's also true that northern states, after a while, largely abolished slavery, and numerous freed persons migrated to Philadelphia from rural areas. So there was a push, right? Formerly enslaved people, now free, pushing for their rights, doing things like founding African Methodist churches, saying, we're going to stick around here because we want to be part of this great American experience. There was also the Seneca Village, a Black-owned community in what is now New York City. It would have been located in Central Park. Here, in that area, there was the right to own property, a really big and new deal, and also the right to vote. That community was ultimately displaced by Central Park. It would have been on the Upper East Side, believe it or not. There were also women's rights conventions, like the Seneca conventions, where women, and I should note, mostly white women, had said, well, we're really questioning our plight here. Mostly husbands and fathers directed the lives of women at the time. And the common law prohibited women from inheriting property, signing contracts, serving on juries, and the like. And there were women who said, well, wait a minute. In this great American experience, we want our vote to be bigger. And so the Seneca Falls Convention, the Rochester Convention, and other women's rights conventions said, we'd like to question that. We want to push against that. And of course, there was pushback. Who are these self-righteous women? Why don't they know their place? The Bible indicates blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. And then the Reconstruction Amendments. The Civil War was, I think, fairly stated a rupture for the United States. Slavery and its abolition was a large part of the reason for the war. And so after the war, we entered into a Reconstruction period, and we had the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery forever. Remember that our Constitution specifically allowed for slavery, not only allowed for slavery when it was first drafted, but did things to protect slavery, like return slaves when they escaped. To put down slave rebellions and the like. So the 13th Amendment said, nope, not doing that anymore. Slavery's abolished. The 14th Amendment, among other things, established due process of law. Right? It said that if the state is going to do something, like try you for a crime or deport you, it has to allow you due process of law, which later began to be construed as an example of having a trial by a jury or having a hearing to discuss the ins and outs of a deportation proceeding and the like. What due process of law would mean in particular situations would vary, but the idea was that things couldn't simply be done on the whim of an individual. The king couldn't say, I don't like Robin Parker, he's deported, and we're done. The The 14th Amendment also said that anyone born in the United States would be a citizen of the United States. Well, why was that important? Well, slaves were born in the United States, right? But there was some question as to whether they should be allowed citizenship. And so the 14th Amendment said, you're born here, you're a citizen. End of story.
Interesting, Ryan, though, that those two issues that you just lifted up, due process and the right to claim citizenship if you're born here, even your parents may be from somewhere else, are things that we're back again litigating because this administration seems to feel like those two things are not worth keeping.
Yes, interesting that we're going back to the 1800s, doesn't it? Isn't it? Yeah. Even the 15th Amendment that prohibited discrimination in voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous servitude, which could mean being an indentured servant. A tax on that. Who does get the right to vote? And how are we going to handle that? So those amendments were passed, but they were contested issues, right? There were folks that said, don't know whether the slaves or the now formerly enslaved people should have the right to vote. Not quite sure about that. What's this due process of law? Can't we simply trust the institutions alone to ensure the rights of everyone? And what about voting rights? Wouldn't that be best left to the states? Some people argued. So again, contest. As we get out of that era and go to the Jim Crow and Civil Rights era, we see that especially northern and western states, before the federal government began to pass laws banning discrimination in public accommodations and employment. Public accommodation simply means places where you live, places where you shop, places that are open to the public, including schools. And so what that meant is that in many of those states, there was less systematic school segregation. It often happened anyway de facto, but there was less of it. And there was also a rise in Black-led organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League. Indeed, the Urban League was founded, at least in part, to improve the plight of recently unenslaved people as they began to migrate to northern cities. And also, large cities often pass their own anti-discrimination laws. We also have the civil rights movement that most of us are familiar with in the 1950s and 60s. And that movement was aimed at abolishing legalized racial segregation and discrimination, especially in the South, where Jim Crow laws, the laws that said, we're going to have separate but equal, but it's not really going to be equal, were common. And so there was a great push to end those. The origin of that really came out of Reconstruction, and the way Reconstruction was aimed at liberating people of color, formerly enslaved people, but how a backlash against that was saying, we're not doing that. Guess what? As far as many southern states were concerned, we're doing the separate but equal thing here, federal government, back off. And so what happened is that in many instances, we had segregated housing, the right to exclude people from owning property because of their racial backgrounds, poll taxes, literacy tests, and the like that needed to be overcome. And so the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s says, nope, we need to undo that. Now, folks contested that as well. There were all kinds of things said about it. You're moving too quickly. God thought that the races ought to be separate, some people argued. It's only people on the outside who are agitators, who are trying to make this change. They're communists, they're socialists. All of these horrible things were said about that movement. But the country survived. We moved forward. And out of the civil rights movement, approaches to inclusion, which were still contested, began to arise. And I'm just going to go through them briefly so we can sort of see what was going on. One of them that had to do with modern business is called the cultural competence intercultural approach. America began to find its business legs. It was a superpower now and doing business across the world. And businesses needed a way to communicate, both through language and the knowledge about customs that other countries and other people had. And so the idea of cultural competence, understanding who people were, no matter where they were on the globe, became an important piece for business. That approach focused on differences and how it is from an American or self point of view, those people were different from us. So the advantages is that it was an attempt to understand that not everything that people did across the globe was centered around a culture here in the United States. The downside is that the evaluation of that, oh, these people are more this way than we are. These people speak a language different from us in this way, right? In other words, it was a how are you different from me, never was how am I different from you. Still, progress. Legal compliance approach. After the civil rights legislation that took place in the 60s, businesses had to find a way to protect themselves. And so we began to see the rise of departments within businesses and corporations whose job it was to ensure that the laws against discrimination were not broken. Two reasons. One, because there was a hope that the diversity that was coming in, this was a time that began with the idea of integration, that this diversity could be leveraged in positive ways. And two, lawsuits around discrimination were costly, right? You'd get hauled into court or hauled in for a hearing, and you'd have to litigate it, and you'd have to go round and round and round and round and round. And businesses didn't want to do that, right? They wanted to avoid having to litigate those things. And so the legal compliance approach, it's like, how is it that we don't violate the laws of discrimination, was another lens that arose. It was rooted in the idea that we need to manage diversity so we can stay out of trouble and also do better. As you can imagine, that legal compliance approach was often became interpreted as the way that we do our best around diversity and inclusion is to not deal with diversity and inclusion, to be oblivious to color, not notice it. We can say we didn't notice it, we're not going to be in trouble. We can say I don't notice whether someone's a woman, a man, if I didn't notice their ethnicity, certainly if I didn't notice their sexual orientation and the like, we're doing a good job. And so, although not mandated, much of the legal compliance approach pushed people into the old bromines. Oh, I don't see color. Oh, I don't care if you're black, white, brown, red, or polka dot. Everybody is the same for me, to me. And what we know from psychology is that isn't true, right? We notice gender as a species almost immediately. We notice um, racial features almost immediately. All of those things are part of things that we have been taught to pick up. And so there's a really bad lesson there about lying to yourself, right? And if you lie to yourself, as we'll talk more in some later episodes, you're really not undoing the latent prejudice that may be there. And so legal compliance approach is good because it says, let's follow the law. Bad also because it doesn't give good examples of how we can really begin to get along in some authentic ways. There's also the valuing difference approach, and this comes out of cultural pluralism, the idea that we're just one big happy salad bowl of people, and that the way that we can get along, or the reason that we don't get along, is because we don't appreciate one another enough. And so this valuing difference approach helps spur on things like, let's celebrate this person's day or that person's month, right? We have their heroes and holidays. Oh yeah, Harriet Tubman, wasn't she wonderful? Booker T. Washington, wasn't he wonderful? The suffragettes, weren't they wonderful? Let's really celebrate that. And if we can do that and value differences, then we're really making some progress. And of course, that's true, right? It is really important to value differences. The downside of the valuing difference point is it doesn't have any examination of why people are oppressed, right? It simply says, if you really appreciated who Robin Parker is, whatever that appreciation means, mostly heroes and holidays, then the problem would go away. It didn't put any onus other than celebrating someone, whatever that could mean, on people who were doing the celebration to necessarily do anything more. But it did have the proper notion of being able to look at folks and their experiences as different, not always trying to say that, well, we're all exactly the same. And then, of course, we have DEI, which in my estimation it really comes from the three prior approaches that I mentioned. It arose within the last 15 or 20 years as another way of putting a finer point, if you will, on what we should be doing if we're combining cultural competence, legal compliance, and valuing differences. Diversity, equity, and inclusion can be defined differently by different people. Sometimes people would add justice onto this, but it's very loose. Like, what do we mean by we're promoting diversity? Does that mean that if we just have different people in the room, we're doing well? What do we mean by equity? Most people say, well, that means fairness, but fairness for whom, and how do we evaluate it? And inclusion. Certainly, it is true that all of the examples we've been talking about have to do with inclusion, but what's the strategy, right? On what basis do we begin to evaluate who should be included and how? There was no power analysis in there at all. And so that was the downside, and is, I would offer, the downside of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the last approach I want to mention, my favorite, it's the one that my organization, the Beyond Diversity Resource Center, follows, is the anti-oppression approach. The anti-oppression approach says that the problem, if you will, what we need to address is the oppression of groups of people. Oppression is racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, all the oppressions. And which means that we're systematically hurting people using the power of government institutions to keep them down. There's a recognition that, of course, we need to work on individual prejudice. we need to work on individual bigotry, but that people get hurt not simply because of individual prejudice, but because the engine of the state, which can lock people up, which can deport people, which can keep people in jail for really long periods of time, those institutions, if they're not acting in fair and inclusive ways, can cause oppression. Now, the downside of the anti-oppression approach is that it scares people, right? It's like, oh, no, you're talking about anti-racism, you're talking about anti-sexism, all of that stuff. It sounds so negative. And you're accusing me and my wonderful country and my wonderful institution of doing something bad, clutch your pearls, run away. How can you say that, right? And so it asks people who are part of U.S. society to begin to look at themselves squarely. All of the wonderful things that we have been doing as a country, as exemplified by those early Enlightenment thinkers, are still true and need to be celebrated, right? But it's also saying we've got a history that I've talked about previously that can't be ignored, because that history is informing what we're doing now and how we see or don't see people who are hurt by oppression. And so thank you for that. That's just that is a brief example of not only some of the current approaches to diversity, but in broader strokes, some of the efforts that have been going on really for quite a while to say, we the people needs to be broadened in some way. And this is how we'd like to make it wider than it was before, and how people in the society have said, oh, no, you don't. We have some good reasons for holding you back. It is the American push-pull, if you will. I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Robin. Really appreciate that. And again, for us, in being able to have a conversation that is not just centered around race or gender only, that we really begin to think about, and not just think about in terms of, the movement towards greater inclusion as being a contemporary thing. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. So, to your point, the tension around inclusion was there even during colonial time. And a lot of the sort of practices, a lot of the even legal framework that was built to keep people out was being built then. So I think, again, for us, it really facilitates a different kind of conversation. This is maybe a little on the side, but it made me think about last night. I attended a conversation of organizational development practitioners. It was the first conversation that this particular organization pulled together, and there were about 50 people in the call. And what was interesting to me, obviously, folks are responding to the current moment, right? Trying to position OD in the current moment and trying to figure out what is our role? What do we do as OD practitioners? But what was interesting to me then, Robin, is what I felt was a lack of urgency. It was a very polite conversation, right? About practices, about strategies, about communicating, about being nice to each other, and I just couldn't stay in that conversation in that way. So they put us into small groups. And the poor people that ended up in my small group, to have a different conversation that they weren't expecting. Which,
Mm-hmm.
I listen to folks that will say their piece, and I say, okay, for me, kind of where things are is the current moment actually calls for skills and approaches that go beyond the practices of OD, organizational development. Because, for me, organization development is something that works when things are, for the most part, okay, and we're just trying to make things better. What we have right now, I said, is the world is on fire. And if the world is on fire, it requires a different response. Right? Some folks were open to thinking that way, but the larger group, was still so caught up in just conversations about, what are the best OD strategies? What are the skills that we need to bring as practitioners? And I'm like, folks, like you don't seem to know where you're standing right now. And of course, there were also some folks from other parts of the world. It wasn't just folks in the U.S., right? But my point about this, Robin, is that, again, if the conversation is simply about the current moment, then we lose sight of how, as you clearly laid out in your short presentation, the struggle for liberation, for greater inclusion, for greater equity, for greater justice was baked in from the very beginning. And if we don't come with that understanding, then our strategies are responding to something else. Make sense?
I agree. And I think it's also worth saying that one thing that was true of all the Enlightenment thinkers was that they believed in representative government of some kind, right? There was never any room in their minds for the old style government where a clique of people, whether they were the nobility or the church, got to decide who was going to run the show and what was going to happen. They wanted to move away from that. And here's another thing. The Enlightenment thinkers were inspired by the scientific revolution. They believed that they believed that reasoning was the way that we could move forward. Appeals to emotionality, as an example, often which we see here. Oh, they're coming to get you. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. All of that stuff would have been rejected by the Enlightenment thinkers. And so, in many ways, we have an anti-Enlightenment movement which says, we, the folks that are in control, need to take better control, and we need a king, a ruler, or a set of rulers to set things right. And that's very un-American in its original sense, right? The Enlightenment thinkers, whether they were moderate or radical, always thought that we got to use reason. And although how inclusive they were was certainly subject to debate, they would have never supported an autocracy. They never would have supported an individual simply acting on his or her own whims as the root of government. And so, as you point out, understanding the history of the real foundations of the American ideal and the American dream can also help us understand what's really not part of those foundations as well. And I'll also point out and say once again that those Enlightenment thinkers, although they believe that there may be a place, some of them believe that there may be a place for church in the society, were highly, highly suspicious of getting religion actively involved, right? Some of them were atheists, some of them were deists, but they knew that bringing religion into government was a formula for the kind of disasters that they really wanted to avoid that happened in Europe. right?
Right.
You just wake up on the wrong side of religion, and it's time for your head to be chopped off, right? Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
you're done with. So I think, as you point out, um, not only does history inform us about um, what happened back then, but it can also give great clarification on what's the way forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an organization that I've been working with for a few years now. It's called the Groundwater Institute, a racial equity organization. And there's a saying that we use in the work that we do with that organization is diagnosis determines treatment. And I find this so powerful and so useful. Again, if our diagnosis about what we are facing today are simply made out of looking at the current moment through just contemporary eyes, then we're missing what you just laid out in the information you shared before. That there's a trajectory, a historical trajectory that we have been on even before the country was created, that leads to the current moment. This is not a moment in isolation. It's not unique. Some of the rhetoric is not even unique, right? As you were pointing out before, in terms of integration of immigrant groups and the rhetoric that was used to speak
Oh
about
yeah,
that is showing up again, right?
oh yeah. Let's not forget things like when many immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe came because of the industrialization of the United States. They were welcomed, right? Come on over to Ellis Island and work in that factory in New York and Philadelphia. There was a huge backlash, right? You can see even paintings and cartoons where folks were saying, would have a picture of an immigrant disheveled reaching into a nice, well-established white family's plate and taking out the food, right? You can see tests like, oh, in order for you to enter this country, we need a literacy test for you because we really want to keep you out if you're illiterate, among other things. Oh, and by the way, if you're Chinese, we really want to exclude you, right? Not the first time we've been around this. And it comes out of the notion of how much we want to, as a society, we want to expand the openness of the country. And the issues of they're taking our jobs, they're taking our culture, they're taking our money have been constant themes, right? We are a country where, on the one hand, we've got that lovely poem about holding the lamp by the golden door at the base of the Statue of Liberty, but a lot of people have wanted to slam that door shut over our history as well. And simply understanding that can give us great insights into who we are and who we really ought to be, I think.
The other thing, Robin, that it is a conversation that I've been engaging with. Unfortunately, I feel not in a very successful way with some folks. Some folks on our side, so to speak, right? Even practitioners. I was at a conference recently here. I don't know if I had mentioned yet in any of the episodes that I am based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Just so you all know kind of my current context. But I went to a conference recently last month held at Wake Forest University. It was a conference on inclusion and belonging. Over 100 practitioners showed up, and we're having this conversation. And I asked the group at one point, I said, what would it mean for us as practitioners to position ourselves in a place of not how much our work is contested, is maligned, is attacked, and how much space have we lost? And for some, even, I've heard this said by some people, where they're winning, and in my mind, they're not really winning. They're simply, enforcing their views, using all the levers of power that they can use, which actually, I would argue, is an example of why they're losing. Because if they felt that their ideas alone would be able to convince the majority in this country that what they're offering is better, the battle would just be a battle of ideas. But instead, right, they are passing legislation where they say you can't use these words. That's, to me, is the most clear example that they are losing, and the only way they can actually pull weight today is by imposing their ideas on others, right? But I offer this idea again in the conference about saying the fact that we are experiencing this level of pushback and this animosity, this intensity of opposition doesn't come out of a place where we were not winning. As a matter of fact, my argument is we had made such deep progress into rearranging power in the United States that they felt that coming a little too close, and they said, no, we have to push back. Again, this is why looking at the long trajectory of history becomes really important, because what examples do we have? Let's go back and look at Reconstruction, right? And we all know, right? Anyone that has paid any attention to those very short 14 years, because that's all it was, and then, in the hundreds of years of the history of this country, it's a blip, right? You blink and you missed it. But it was a critical moment, a very, very important moment that I think illuminates a lot of what we're going through right now. At that moment, society begins to open up. As you said, Civil Rights Act get passed, 14th Amendment. I mean, and all of a sudden, at that point, you begin to see real advancement. People of color, particularly Black folks, beginning to build wealth. Businesses become doctors, lawyers, etc. Become part of legislatures. It is said, and I think it's still true, that during Reconstruction there were more Black senators in the U.S. Senate than we have today, which should tell us something too, right? But anyway, so we have this moment of huge opening. It lasted 14 years, and what came after that?
Right? The Ku Klux Klan.
Exactly, right? And the most brutal system, even as some folks have argued, Jim Crow being more lethal than slavery, because when we moved into that arrangement of Jim Crow and what's the practice that was established with prisoners during that time, Robin? What was that called?
Oh yeah. I know what you mean. It was the idea that since you've been convicted of a crime, we're going to take you into forced labor. You need to work for the state. Right? Yeah.
Convict leasing. That said, basically, business owners, if you need some labor, come over and rent some of our folks, and we'll lease them to you for whatever period you want, and remove the incentive to keep these folks alive. Because under slavery, they were property, and therefore I would abuse you up to a certain point because I didn't want to lose my property. And under convict leasing, that incentive is completely removed, which made that system even more brutal than slavery.
Right. And I'll just quickly add that, by the way, one of the reasons that you might become convicted is because you don't have a job. And if you don't have a job, you're loitering, right? So you're committing an offense by being unemployed. And, do we have an employment for you.
Yeah, exactly. And we created all kinds of excuses, right? If you don't step off the sidewalk when a white woman is coming your way, you get put in jail. Right? So all kinds of just excuses to put black men in jail so they can be leased. But my point is, again, looking at that whole sort of historical trajectory, is that out of that deep opening and really a fundamental restructuring of the foundation of this society to become really true to its founding ideals, was shut down very quickly and in the most aggressive and sort of punitive way.
Mm-hmm. Which
you can say it is exactly what we're experiencing today. So again, part of what it does for me, Robin, and I hope, again, this is part of what we're trying to engage with our audience in, and particularly practitioners in this work, that our positionality to this current moment should be not one of feeling like our position has been weakened, but simply that our position is the strongest it has been, which is why it can only be attacked through executive orders and legislation at the state level, and enforced through legislative methods and not through public argument.
I agree with you. And in addition to that, I think it's okay to feel a certain sense of sadness.
Of course.
One of the things that makes me sad as I begin to think about where we were is how the post-construction act of lynching, particularly black men and black women, became part of the American fabric. And it was simply a way of either excluding black people from a town or seeking retribution against black people, or sending a message that black people shouldn't get too uppity. Don't push it, right? Don't ask for your rights. Don't vote, and certainly be deferential, right? That just happened, right? And it's a good example of oppression because it could not happen simply because there were a few prejudiced people. The engine of the state, right? The police, the sheriff, the community, all of those people who either actively participated or in some cases celebrated the lynching, allowed that to continue. And my point is that after so many years, as you say, it is unfortunate that we shouldn't be surprised. And it is also saddening, right, that we see not lynching, but other scare tactics being used to keep people in their place, right? To say that, when America was great again was at those old times when women and black people and Latinx people and LGBTQ plus people knew their proper, lower, and obliterated places in American society, right? It is both saddening and, for me, infuriating.
Yeah, and absolutely, right? I don't mean, obviously, to dismiss any of that, because I also feel that, for sure. My point, again, is simply that our framing of this long historical trajectory of a battle over inclusion, greater inclusion in our society, it's not just a battle around race. It's a battle around gender. It's a battle around disability. It's a battle around Native American issues. It's a battle around LGBTQ concerns, right? So it really is all encompassing, and the current pushback against DEI is really the same pushback that has always been there from the beginning about opening up society for all of us that are here.
Indeed. And unfortunately, those people who support no inclusion or less inclusion or smaller inclusion often use the frame of, as I said before, those people, whoever they are, don't know their proper place and they're hurting you.
Yes.
Currently, The idea is that, they're changing your child's gender when they go to school. We all know that that can't happen. Schools are not efficient enough to do that, within the school day, right? It's ridiculous. They're taking all of your money, which also isn't true either, right? Many of the jobs that folks who migrate from Latin America take are not the jobs that U.S. citizens want. Certainly those that work in agriculture are doing some of the toughest, worst paid, and I would offer also the most dangerous jobs that can be had. And so, yeah, it's in some ways the rehash of the same old thing. These people are dangerous and they're taking away your American dream. Let's push back on that and make sure that they are excluded by hook, crook, or presidential order.
That's right. That's right. So I think we're coming down to the end of episode 2 of Robin.
So do we have anything? We have anything happy to say? We sort of been on kind of a downer here, I suppose.
Well, again, Robin, I offer to anyone that is trying to position themselves in opposition to what we are experiencing today, to just firmly plant themselves in a place of the reason why this is happening is because we were winning. Our idea of a greater, more inclusive, more just, more equitable society was actually winning the argument. To the point where and we know, right? I mean, it's not an absolute thing, and some people some institutions were adopting some of this only for window dressing. We know that, right? But it also means that there are some institutions who are actually really saying, no, this is who we are, this is who we want to be, and we're going to keep working on this. But as a matter of fact, I just saw a statement from the president of Marriott that basically said, we were founded on the idea that our hotels were open to everyone, and that because of that, also it meant our guests as well as our employees. We're not changing, right? I mean, that's clarity right there, right? So I think again, the idea is it is extremely frustrating, sad, as you said, enraging that we have to be exposed to what is happening right now. But let's not lose sight that the reason why it's happening is because we were winning.
And I would offer that we are still in the process of winning.
Absolutely.
Right? That folks like you and me and many others have a voice to say we're not going to put up with things that are lies. First of all, we're going to look at history, and to the extent that the engine of the government is trying to pit us against one another with things that aren't true, right? Because we're human beings. We can have reason, right? We don't have to take anybody's word for something, right? We can research. We can find out where the problem really lies. It means that we can do better. And that I believe that if we're truly compassionate about everyone, and I do want everybody to succeed, right? Not just Black people like me, not just LGBTQ people like me. I want everybody to have a chance. That with that attitude, we can really do some good stuff. For me, that's the American dream.
Absolutely. So that is the high note to end in. Again, we can look at everything that we've been discussing here today, and there's always that dark side, right? There's always sort of the way in which too many people get dehumanized by narratives, by institutional approaches, by ideas held by individuals. But at the end of the day, again, we have been in a field that has made a real dent in building a different kind of world. And I, again, urge our listeners, our supporters, to not lose sight of that, because the moment we begin to lose that sort of part of our narrative, they win. They win. So thank you, Robin, again for a really powerful conversation. I see you're letting folks know that they need to support our channel.
Absolutely. We so appreciate it too. You don't know what a thumbs up or even a small comment means to us. So appreciate it. We hope that you enjoyed this episode and the ones that will be upcoming.
See you next time, folks. Take care.
Take care.